Here we go again.
No, not again.
You've been fooled.
How long have we been doing this?
Once more unto the again until we're both dead.
Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews and connections in mind. I've already reviewed a couple of films in the month of March, starting with Logan and then Kong Skull Island, and this time we see Life, starring Ryan Reynolds, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Rebecca Ferguson, directed by Daniel Espinosa. Life is the story of a group of astronauts aboard the International Space Station in the near future, in which a soil sample is brought back from Mars, which seems to contain a certain life form. They start studying it. Of course, they soon find out that the life form does not want to be a lab rat much longer. Now, this video review will contain spoilers of Life, as well as a couple other films. There will be a full list in the description below. And if you've not seen Life yet, or any of the films listed below, and want to wait until you have, stop the video at this point and come back later. With these things in mind, though, let's begin. So Life is the story of 6 astronauts aboard the International Space Station, and they recover a probe returning from Mars with soil samples that seem to contain a new form of life, a life that was previously on Mars. Now they begin to culture it, and is eventually named Calvin by a group of school children on Earth, and they find that in the words of the scientists, that each individual cell is both a muscle, a brain, and an eye. So that presents a very unique sort of creature, and it starts out small, and over the course of a couple weeks it grows into a bigger life form. But the creature does not respond well to a certain experimentation, and soon turns on the crew, and they start dying off one by one. Now, this film borrows heavily from Alien, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. In horror movies in general, they tend to follow a very similar storyline. They introduce a set of characters, put them in a setting that tends to isolate them from the outside world. They introduce a creature monster villain who ends up picking them off one by one. And by the end, you're only left with 1 or 2 of the main characters, and everyone else is dead, and the creature ends up somewhere dead, or there's usually a twist ending where he may not be dead. Who knows? Now, Alien follows this formula because we are introduced to the crew of the Nostromo, and they discover the xenomorph, and currently as the facehugger entity on John Hurt's character. They bring it aboard. They effectively isolate themselves aboard the Nostromo. The xenomorph comes out. It turns out to be very aggressive and starts killing the members of the crew one by one until only Ripley is left. Now, you can see this in Life in that, as I said, this is a group of astronauts aboard the ISS, a very isolated setting. They discover a new life form. The life form turns out to be aggressive and deadly. It starts killing off the crew one by one until only Rebecca Ferguson and Jake Gyllenhaal survive. Now, as far as the movie's villain is concerned, the alien life form known as Calvin, I find this is very similar, in certain instances, to the Andromeda Strain, which was a novel by Michael Crichton, but was turned into a film in the 60s and a TV miniseries in the early 2000s, in which a extraterrestrial single cell life form is brought to Earth. It starts killing people, and then this group of scientists takes it to the wildfire laboratory in order to study it, and they isolate themselves. But this alien disease gets loose and starts wreaking havoc. Finally, plot-wise, this film shares a lot in common with Gravity, especially towards Life's third act. In Gravity, we see Sandra Bullock's character get stranded in space, and we see her trying to use the technology of the various space programs to get back down to Earth. But as we see, the International Space Station gets destroyed by flying debris, and by the end she has to get on a Soyuz capsule to get down to Earth. And in Life, we see, once again, after Calvin has done his work, the International Space Station suffers a calamity in which most of it is destroyed, or is losing life support rapidly. And then Rebecca Ferguson and Jake Gyllenhaal must escape the International Space Station via the Soyuz capsules, and then they must return to Earth. Or at least Rebecca Ferguson's character must. Now, visually, there's nothing wrong with this film. It's a gorgeous film. Much like Gravity before it, this film's space sequences are very good. The CG work does not break you out of the action. And visually, there's near the beginning of the film, there's a long, unbroken take of the inside of the International Space Station, where we are introduced to the crew as they are going through the space station and attempting to recover the probe from coming in from Mars. Now, stylistically, this is very similar to the opening scenes of Gravity, in which the opening shots of introducing us to the characters is done in one long take, and we see the camera panning around, showing us these beautiful vistas. But I would submit that this is also very similar to not the opening scene, but one of the introductory scene in the movie Serenity, in which we are introduced to the main characters of the ship Serenity, and it is done all in one long unbroken take, and we get to see the crew of the Serenity and the ship Serenity, the setting, all in one take. And it's also taking place during a crisis. In the case of Serenity, the ship going through re-entry, and they might burn up in the atmosphere. Of course they don't, but that's the situation that they're in there. So what I say you should, do I recommend that you see this film? I would say you can go see it, but you have to know a few things going in. First of all, there's nothing wrong with this film, but there's not necessarily a lot right with this film. It's very middle of the road. And what I mean by that is this movie banks on its star power to get you into the door, mainly Ryan Reynolds, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Rebecca Ferguson, the three main actors who are listed on the movie poster. And for a while there, it seems like a great match. Like Ryan Reynolds, since this is from the writing team who gave you Deadpool, they gave all of the best one-liners to Ryan Reynolds, obviously, and they come off really well. Unfortunately, he's killed off about a third of the way through the film, and the rest of the characters are very underdeveloped. The typical horror film, which is what you would expect, but if you're looking for anything else from the star power, you're not really going to get a whole lot. Also, I would say this movie has a very effective twist ending, but the way that they shot it and the way they presented it meant that, I'm not going to spoil the twist ending, but I will say the way they presented it, you could guess what the twist ending is coming from well before it actually happens, and then you're left with like, oh, okay, yeah, that's the twist ending. All right, that's kind of interesting. And for a horror film, I would say that this is where the movie diverges from Alien. At least I say in Alien, this film, that film was predominantly a horror film with a sci-fi setting and basis to the horror, but it was primarily a horror film. Now, there are other films that are sci-fi films but have horror elements to them. Now, this film is trying to be a little bit of both, and it doesn't really quite work. It doesn't know whether it wants to go full sci-fi or full horror, and it doesn't really come off as being anything more than that. However, I will say, if you know going in that this movie is banking on star power to get you through the door, and while there's nothing really new groundbreaking in this film, that it's a traditional horror film with some sci-fi elements thrown in, I will give him that the creature design is very interesting in the beginning. I would have preferred it if it had stayed small, but once it got bigger, it turned into kind of like a flower octopus dragon thing, and it was just kind of generic. It would have been much more interesting. It was much more interesting when it was a smaller life form. But other than that, I would say if you know this going in, then you'll be fine. I don't recommend going to see this on like a weekend. I would say if you can see it at a matinee, that would probably be fine. But yeah, that's my recommendation I would say don't not see this film, but don't get too excited about this film either. So yeah, there's my review of Life. Thank you for watching. I also do written reviews on IMDb. There will be a link in the description below. And check out my other written reviews on IMDb. I do them for every new movie release I do. And there will be a couple movies coming out in April that I will be hopefully to do some written reviews and You've Seen It Before reviews. And yeah, so look to that content soon. And just remember, there's nothing new under the sun. And yes, you have seen it before. So until next time, thank you for watching.